Hey guys, this is Billy from adultcello.com, and today I wanted to make a video sharing the habits and characteristics of my top students, what they do, okay? So right off the bat, let me just say, when I talk about top students, I'm not talking about always individual students I've had, and I'm not talking about the most advanced students playing the hardest repertoire that I've been teaching. When I talk about top students, I'm talking about periods of time in my students' journey when I'm teaching them and I see them kind of hit, there's just this aha moment, and then suddenly they're off to the races and the progress is just much faster and it seems easier, everything's kind of clicking. So I just want to make sure to make clear that this isn't about individual people who are just more talented or make faster progress. This is what I've noticed in my students and honestly in myself during my journey. When I'm exhibiting these traits, my progress goes through the roof. So just in case, if you're new to the channel, my name's Billy. I started the cello from scratch at age 25. I couldn't read sheet music, and now I'm a professional cellist, and I specialize in helping other adult learners get where they want to go quicker so that they don't have to take the super long route like I did. All right, so we're about to dive into the list. What I'd like to say is I'm not making a list here for you to just kind of critique yourself and be like, yep, I have none of those traits. These are all traits that you can adopt. And that's kind of why I'm sharing this, is to give you some food for thought. So much of the journey for cello is getting good instruction, getting the right knowledge, and putting in hard work. That we know. For adult learners, a huge, huge part of it is the mindset you bring to the practice room, to the cello when you sit down before you've even played a note. A big kind of part of the trajectory of your practice for the day is already decided based on what your mindset is, what you think about when you practice, what you worry about, what you fixate on, and these, fortunately, are all things we can change. All right, so we'll dive right in. Number one, first characteristic I've noticed is what I'm going to call focused practice. What that means is not just putting in time. Sadly, this isn't something I did myself in the early part of my journey, and that's part of the reason it took so long for me to build really effective practice habits, is I just threw hours and hours at my journey, but I didn't really always mindfully think about what exactly I was trying to practice. I was just learning pieces and then just repeating things over and over. When my students and myself, when I'm really hitting a stride, I'm sitting down with very clear intentions of what I need to practice that day. I'm sitting down and I'm thinking, okay, I'm playing this piece, yes, and I'm working on this passage, yes, but what about this passage needs work? Okay, is it the bow arm? What am I going to work on? Am I going to slow the tempo down? What if it's left hand? What exactly is it? A shift? Is it a string crossing? Is it a finger coordination thing? The more specific you are with your practice and you're clear with your objective and goals, the more you'll get out of it. So if this is something you think maybe you're not doing right now, what I would say is when you go to your lessons, I would record them, okay? And I would listen through to, maybe same day, the next day if you want. You go through the whole lesson once and you pick out those critical moments. You're not going to have to do the whole lesson again every time you sit down. You just pick out some critical moments in the lesson where you're like, okay, that's what I need to work on. That's the problem. And then you're thinking, okay, what exactly are we talking about here? Is it coordination of the two hands? Is it a right hand issue? Is it a left hand issue? And then when you sit down to practice, you can, if you want, you can reference the lesson to, if your teacher kind of is demonstrating to show you what to do, or you can listen to yourself and you're like, oh, okay, now I hear what he or she is talking about. Let me work on this. And honestly, it's just easier to come home and be like, okay, oh, that was a great lesson. I learned these things. And then you just start practicing, but you just kind of you just practice. You're like, I know I got to work on those things, but let me just kind of noodle around and work on this piece. I think I know what I want. In my own experience early on in my journey, I remember all too often kind of coming home from a great lesson where I learned something and then just sort of practicing, and I'm keeping the topic in my head as I practice, but I'm not even really carefully monitoring my own work. And I was basically just doing my old habit, but thinking that, okay, this is what I'm working on right now, but I wasn't actually changing anything. I was just, kind of putting in practice because it was just honestly easier than going back to the video, watching the lesson, thinking carefully, trying to imagine what the right thing would look like and feel like, and then trying it that way. So what I'm saying is record your lessons, record your playing if you're willing to do that, and when you come home from a lesson, jot down the 2 or 3 essential things you need to work on so that it's very clear what you need to do. All right, so characteristic number 2 is having flexible roaming goals. I think one of the biggest things for adults that are making a lot of progress is they're able to figure out what they need to be working on at this moment in time. There'll be times where you're like, okay, I need to get a lot of notes under my hands. I want to learn some new pieces. My goal is to learn this piece and then this piece. Then there's other times where it's like, I can play some pieces. I don't like how I sound. It's going to be better for me to forget about learning pieces right now and just work on pulling a beautiful, rich sound with the bow and working on my bow grip because my hand's getting so tired I can't even get through the pieces I want to play. Then there's other times where you're like, okay, my left hand is cramping up. I can play longer pieces, but I'm obviously doing something wrong because I'm just like in pain after playing a piece. So what I find with the students, including myself early on, that I struggled with was you kind of see this as a like gradus ad parnassum kind of thing where just step by step towards greatness, and you're okay, well, I'm in this book and then I'm going to do these etudes in order because this is 19 and then comes 20 in the book, and I'm just going to slowly work my way up. And I think if you're willing to think about your goals as not just like, because the goal is not to get through a book of etudes. The goal is to become a cellist, be able to make beautiful sound. So if you can pull things apart sometimes and be like, okay, I'm just going to work on, maybe for a week it's going to be like a D major scale, which I learned a couple weeks into playing. I'm just going to level up the sound I can make on a D major scale. That kind of willingness is going to really help advance you because you'll be able to pinpoint things that are really limiting your growth and have them like flourish in a short period of time versus, okay, I know I have to work my bow arm, but I'm not going to give up working on this hard piece for me. So I'm just going to sort of try to work on my bow arm while I'm playing this piece that's currently a little over my head. It's a good intention, but it's going to be way harder to accomplish than like, forget the piece right now, I'm just going to work on sound. All right, characteristic number 3 is having flexibility with principles. This is a tricky one, especially early on in your journey. To learn the cello with any kind of systematic approach, you're going to have to kind of pare things down and simplify things to an extent. And so you'll learn these rules and principles. You do not want a bow that's not parallel to the bridge, for example. You do not want a hand shape that doesn't look squared off and perpendicular to the fingerboard. You do want this, you do want that. This has to be like this. You learn all these things. And then the moment comes where you have to break a rule on purpose. And it gets, I've felt this before too, where it's like, hey, what you told me last week I have to, keep it parallel. Now you're telling me that like I have to deliberately skew my bow angle to change lanes, but that's breaking the rule. And it's like, well, unfortunately you made progress. And so now the cello is going to get more complicated because that's why we play it our whole lives and we don't get bored. There's so much to what you can do on a cello. With the adult learner, that's where it can be a little difficult. If you take the negative view, it's like you just lied to me because you told me this is a principle, a rule I'm not going to break. Now 6 months later, I'm breaking it consistently. So at the end of the day, just remember that a lot, if not all of cello playing is based on context. And so depending on what you need to do to express yourself and to express the music you're trying to play, that's what's going to be needed from your 2 arms and your brain. And so you're going to learn these principles, but then as things get more complicated, fortunately, you don't have to stick to these limited rules and guidelines all the time. And when your teacher starts pointing these things out, congratulations, it means you've advanced and now you can start incorporating more advanced techniques into your playing. All right, characteristic number 4 is my top students don't care. So let me qualify that quickly. What I mean is that if we just take a look at most, talented children, okay, there are exceptions, but most kids who are doing well and they're, learning the instrument, one thing that they have that we tend not to have is most kids don't really care when they are practicing. They're doing it because maybe their parents told them to. They don't feel like I am my violin sound. Like if I make a mistake, I'm ugly. It's just a thing. It's like learning to play baseball, learning to play violin. It's just you just learn how to do it and you just try things. So when a teacher says try this, you just try it. I think a lot of adult learners, that's something that kids do that we can take from. When I say don't care, I think you should care passionately about achieving your goals, but I think you should allow yourself to not care in the moment at times so that you can experiment freely. Okay, so you're not judging every effort you make. If you're instantly going to judge yourself, let's say you're working on something with the bow arm and then you play slightly out of tune and you stop and you're like, oh, that was out of tune. It's like you're not even working on the left hand right now. Caring too much can actually hinder growth. I know that from personal experience. Okay, so that's when I say don't care, is that my top students, when things are really going, there's just, it's a little less neurotic. It's just kind of like, okay, this is fun. Okay, sure, I'll try this. Wow, okay, that was interesting. And it's just like free efforts without worrying about the result, just kind of gathering information from the result. So just from personal experience, I had this at times when I was working with, one of the world-class teachers I was lucky to study with. I would be so obsessed with showing them that I can do it and that and then also wanting myself wanting to make those strides and have it happen, that I would follow their prescriptions so dogmatically that it was like a robot sitting down practicing, where that ultimately kind of left where I felt short. It became a very mental principle, but the problem is you play cello physically. And so there is going to be a degree of physical experimentation with this principle you're thinking about and figuring out, okay, I've learned this topic. What does that mean for me and my body? Like, how does that feel to pull the sound he's talking about, or to coordinate the shift this way? And a lot of that is then you just have to experiment freely without judgment so that you can try things, and then without judging, you'll have this mental bandwidth to actually think about, not in a like negative, but in a constructive way. And honestly, you just need to make mistakes in your practice. They often will be as insightful as when you have an aha moment and you do it the right way, because it helps to realize, okay, this didn't work. When I do this feeling, this is leading me down the wrong road. So mistakes are helpful. All right, and characteristic number 5, I left it to the end because it's probably the least exciting. And I'm not saying my top students are the ones that already know music theory, but when I've noticed my students putting in the time to learn basic music theory, interval recognition, chords and how they function in harmony, the building blocks of the Western musical canon, that usually is accompanied by a massive gain in terms of how fast they learn pieces and how well they memorize pieces, and just familiarity with a piece so that you don't end up just feeling completely at sea if you get off by a little bit. This is something I experienced firsthand. I did, start from scratch. So when I had my first cello lesson, I didn't know what a whole note was yet, or a half note, or any of that. The more my musical literacy improved, and I went back to the local junior college, and I took, music fundamental class, and I learned as much as I could about, harmony and like arpeggios and the way, basically the building blocks of music and harmony and how it all works together. I found myself improving dramatically. I'm not saying necessarily my intonation improved by knowing what a chord was, but my understanding, like, oh, okay, right here, I'm just playing an arpeggio. Okay, now I just changed chords. That's what these notes are. So instead of a group of random notes that I have to memorize one by one, oh, this is just an F major arpeggio, going up and down. Stuff like that was amazing in terms of my own growth, and I've noticed that in my students too. If you aren't, highly musically literate, I hate to say this because so many people see it as kind of like this chore and something that they don't want to do. Doing, ear training, for interval ear training off of the cello, you can do it on musictheory.net, for example. I'll have a link below. And just learning as much as you can stand of music theory will dramatically improve the rate at which you learn pieces and the rate at which you feel comfortable with the music you're making. So there you go. Those are the 5 characteristics that I see in my top students when they're, really hitting stride, and they're the characteristics I've noticed in myself when I'm also in like just a period of huge growth. If you like the video, please consider subscribing. I'd really appreciate it, and I'll see you next week.